Walter Reynolds gripped his small suitcase with white knuckles, staring out the car window as familiar city streets gave way to countryside. His heart pounded painfully in his chest. After weeks of begging his adopted son Marcus to take him to a nursing home, the day had finally come. The 72-year-old widower fought back tears, wondering how it had come to this, being discarded after decades of love and sacrifice. "You could have at least chosen somewhere closer to home," Walter said, his voice breaking with bitterness. "Or is that the point? To dump me somewhere I can't find my way back? What would you do if you were in Walter's shoes, feeling abandoned by the very people you love most?" Share your thoughts in the comments below, and follow along as this story takes an unexpected turn that will challenge everything you thought you knew about family bonds. Walter Reynolds sat quietly in his small borrowed bedroom in Austin, Texas, gazing out the window at the bustling city streets below. At 72, he'd always been a proud man who valued his independence, but now his body had grown weaker, his memory hazier, and his heart heavier. Living with his son Marcus and daughter-in-law Eliza, Walter felt like a shadow of the man he used to be. The guilt gnawed at him constantly. Every time he saw their son's room that he now occupied, the quick goodbyes his family gave before heading to work, and the meals delivered by Diane, their neighbor. The idea of moving to a nursing home had started to seem less like exile and more like relief for everyone involved. But beneath his stoic exterior, Walter longed for something he couldn't name. He didn't just feel forgotten. He felt unnecessary, redundant, a burden. Life hadn't always been this way. His mind often drifted back to their small wooden home in San Antonio, where he and his late wife Evelyn had built a life together. Evelyn had brought warmth to his world, her laughter echoing in every corner of their house. Walter had adopted Marcus when he married Evelyn. The boy wasn't his by blood, but from the first moment Marcus called him Dad, Walter had vowed to give him everything. Together, they had turned a modest home into a sanctuary filled with love, hard work, and simple joys. Walter had been a man of the land, tending to his garden with the help of Jasper, his loyal horse. But all that changed the night of the fire. One evening, Walter lit a candle during a power outage. Exhausted from a day of harvesting potatoes with Jasper, he fell asleep on the sofa. By the time he woke, the air was thick with smoke. Neighbors broke down the door, dragging him to safety. But the house, his memories, Evelyn's belongings, their shared life, was reduced to ashes. When Walter awoke in the hospital 24 days later, doctors told him he had been lucky to survive. He didn't feel lucky. He felt empty. Marcus brought him to Austin to recover. Walter left not only his home behind, but also a piece of his soul. Life in Marcus and Eliza's apartment wasn't what Walter had hoped. They were busy with work and seemed distant, leaving Diane, the neighbor, to care for his meals and needs. Though kind, Diane didn't hold back her opinions. "They don't want you here, Walter," she said one day, shaking her head. "It's the same everywhere. Once we get old, our children don't want to deal with us." Her words haunted him. On his birthday, Walter sat alone with a slice of cake Diane had left. Marcus and Eliza had wished him well that morning but didn't stay to celebrate. The loneliness was suffocating. Walter couldn't take it any longer. One evening he cornered Marcus in the hallway. "Take me to a nursing home," he said firmly. "Sell my land in San Antonio. Use the money to pay for it. I don't want to be a burden to you or Eliza anymore." "Dad, not now," Marcus replied with a sigh. "We'll talk about it later. I've had a long day." Walter's frustration boiled over. "If you won't do it, I will. I'll find a nursing home myself." Marcus simply patted his shoulder and walked away, leaving Walter feeling more invisible than ever. Days bled into weeks, and Walter's pleas to be taken to a nursing home seemed to vanish into thin air. Each night he sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the worn photograph of Evelyn he kept tucked in his wallet, whispering apologies to her for the burden he had become. His heart felt heavier with every passing day, the silence in Marcus and Eliza's home amplifying his loneliness. Then, on a bright Saturday morning, everything changed. Marcus walked into Walter's room carrying a crisp white shirt, a pair of neatly folded slacks, and a new set of toiletries. Eliza followed with fresh towels and sheets tucked under her arm. "Pack your things, Dad," Marcus said, his voice steady but unreadable. "We're going on a trip." Walter froze, his hands trembling as he clutched the photograph. The words echoed in his ears, filling him with a bittersweet mix of relief and sorrow. Finally, he thought, "They're taking me." He nodded silently, not daring to meet Marcus's eyes, afraid that he might see pity, or, worse, guilt. He packed quickly, methodically, folding his few clothes with precision. His heart ached as he placed Evelyn's photograph on top of the pile, zipping the suitcase with a finality that felt like a goodbye. The car ride began in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound. Walter sat in the back seat, clutching his suitcase tightly, his knuckles white. Marcus drove, his eyes fixed on the road, while Eliza stared out the window, a small smile playing at her lips. To Walter, her smile felt out of place, a hint of joy on what he believed was meant to be a somber day. As they left Austin city limits, the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets gave way to rolling hills and sprawling farmland. The scenery seemed to blur together, but to Walter, every detail stood out vividly. The weathered fences lining the road, the clusters of wildflowers dotting the fields, the occasional old oak tree standing tall against the sky. The sights reminded him of his younger days, of drives with Evelyn through the countryside, their laughter filling the air as they imagined growing old together. Walter's thoughts drifted further into the past. He remembered Evelyn's laugh, the way it bubbled out of her when he told one of his terrible jokes. He remembered Marcus's first steps, how his little boy had stumbled and fallen into his arms, his giggles echoing through their home. And he remembered his garden in San Antonio, the rich, earthy smell of freshly turned soil as he and Jasper worked side by side to nurture their crops. He let out a shaky sigh, his eyes welling up. He wasn't just leaving his family behind. He was leaving behind a lifetime of memories, a home that no longer existed, and the dreams he and Evelyn had once shared. Marcus glanced at Walter in the rearview mirror, noticing the old man wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "You okay back there, Dad?" he asked, his tone casual but concerned. Walter quickly stuffed the handkerchief back into his pocket and forced a small nod. "I'm just tired." Eliza turned around in her seat and smiled softly at him. "We're almost there. You'll feel better soon." Walter nodded again, his throat tightening. "Almost there." The words rang in his ears. Was it a promise of relief or confirmation of his greatest fear? As the car climbed a winding road surrounded by dense trees, Walter realized he no longer recognized the area. His heart began to race. There were no houses, no signs of civilization, only the occasional break in the trees where sunlight streamed through. The road seemed endless, stretching into a lonely horizon. He swallowed hard, his hands gripping his suitcase tighter. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "You'll see," Marcus replied cryptically, a faint smile on his lips. Walter's mind raced with possibilities. Was this road leading to a secluded nursing home far from the city? Was this their way of leaving him behind, out of sight and out of mind? The car eventually slowed, crunching over gravel as it pulled into a clearing. Marcus killed the engine and turned to face Walter, his expression unreadable. "We're here, Dad." Walter hesitated, his body stiff as Marcus stepped out and opened the back door. He helped Walter out of the car, guiding him gently as Eliza grabbed the suitcase. Walter adjusted his glasses, his heart pounding in his chest. He squinted against the sunlight, expecting to see the dull gray facade of a nursing home. Instead, his breath caught in his throat. Before him stood a house he recognized all too well. His house, but it wasn't the charred, blackened skeleton he had last seen. It was fully restored, gleaming as if it had been plucked from his memories and brought back to life. The white paint shimmered under the sunlight. The porch railings were sturdy and new, and the windows sparkled with a clarity that felt surreal. Walter's knees buckled, and Marcus quickly caught him. "Careful, Dad," he said softly. "Careful, Dad," he said softly. What is this?" Walter stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus smiled, his eyes glistening. "Welcome home, Dad?" As Walter stood before the gleaming facade of his rebuilt home, his legs wobbled and he clutched Marcus's arm for support. It wasn't just the house, it was the life it represented, a life he thought had turned to ash along with its wooden beams. He blinked rapidly, trying to convince himself this wasn't a dream. "Come inside, Dad," Marcus said gently, leading him toward the porch. Eliza followed, carrying his suitcase. Walter hesitated for a moment, his fingers brushing over the smooth, freshly painted railing. The smell of pine and varnish filled the air. Each step onto the porch felt surreal, like stepping into a memory that had been resurrected. The front door creaked open, revealing the interior. Walter gasped. The layout was familiar, yet everything felt new. Polished wood floors, walls painted in soft, warm tones, and furniture that echoed the cozy charm he and Evelyn had once created together. On the mantel above the fireplace, a single framed photograph caught his eye. A picture of him and Evelyn on their wedding day, their smiles frozen in time. "How?" Walter's voice broke as he turned to Marcus. Marcus gestured for him to sit in his old armchair, restored and reupholstered with the same fabric Evelyn had once chosen. "Dad, we never planned to send you to a nursing home," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "We knew how much this house meant to you, so when it burned down, we made it our mission to rebuild it. We couldn't tell you because, well, we wanted it to be a surprise. We used the land you loved so much as the foundation for something new," Eliza chimed in, her hand resting on Walter's shoulder. The neighbors chipped in too. Everyone wanted to help. Marcus reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn envelope. "Do you remember those papers you signed months ago?" Walter nodded, his brow furrowing. "You said it was to sell the land." Marcus shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, Dad. They were construction permits. We needed your approval to start rebuilding. Every nail, every beam, it's all for you." Walter's eyes filled with tears, his breath hitching. "I thought I had lost everything. Evelyn, this house, everything." Marcus handed him a thick photo album, its edges slightly singed but intact. "Not everything, Dad. Look." Walter's hands trembled as he opened the album. Inside were photographs that had survived the fire, pictures of him and Evelyn dancing at their anniversary, Marcus as a baby taking his first steps, and Evelyn planting flowers in the garden. The pages smelled faintly of smoke, but the images were vivid, bursting with life. Walter traced his fingers over a photograph of Evelyn, holding a basket of freshly picked vegetables, her smile radiant. "She loved that garden," he murmured, tears spilling onto the page. Just as he thought his heart couldn't take any more, a familiar sound reached his ears. A gentle whinny echoed from outside, pulling Walter from his reverie. He froze, his eyes widening. "Is that?" Marcus grinned and gestured toward the door. "Come and see." Walter shuffled to the porch, his heart pounding. There, tied to a newly built post near the garden, stood Jasper, his beloved horse. The old stallion's coat gleamed in the sunlight, his mane freshly brushed. Walter's breath caught in his throat as Jasper let out another whinny and stomped the ground, as if calling out to him. "Jasper!" Walter exclaimed, tears now flowing freely. He hurried down the steps as fast as his legs could carry him. The horse turned its head, recognizing its old master instantly. Walter wrapped his arms around Jasper's neck, burying his face in the animal's mane. "You're alive!" "I thought I'd lost you too." Eliza joined Marcus on the porch, watching the emotional reunion. "We found him a few weeks after the fire," she explained. "He'd wandered into the outskirts of town. The neighbors helped care for him until we could bring him back." Walter stood there for a long moment, his hand gently stroking Jasper's mane. The warmth of the horse's body, the solid feel of the house behind him, and the presence of his family filled him with a deep, unshakable peace. He turned back to Marcus, his voice choked with gratitude. "You did all of this for me?" Walter asked, his voice trembling. Marcus nodded. "You've done so much for me, Dad. For us. This is just a small way to show you how much we love you." Walter shook his head, overcome. "This isn't small, son. This This is everything." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Walter sat on the porch with Marcus and Eliza. Jasper grazed peacefully in the yard, and the distant sound of crickets filled the air. Walter clutched the photo album to his chest, a smile playing on his lips. For the first time in years, he felt whole. His heart, once heavy with loss and loneliness, was now brimming with joy. The home he thought he'd lost forever had been returned to him, not just in bricks and wood, but in love, effort, and family. "I was wrong," Walter said softly, breaking the silence. "I thought I was a burden, but you've shown me that I'm anything but." Marcus reached over and clasped his father's hand. "You're not a burden, Dad. You're our foundation." Walter looked at his son, then at the house, then at Jasper grazing peacefully. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it. Have you ever misinterpreted someone's intentions, only to discover they were planning something beautiful for you all along? Share your experience in the comments below, and let us know how it changed your perspective. As the evening deepened, Walter unpacked in his rebuilt home, his heart full for the first time in years. The golden sunset bathed the newly constructed house in warm light, highlighting every loving detail Marcus and Eliza had incorporated. Walter found himself standing in the middle of the living room, his eyes darting from corner to corner. Every detail, every plank, every photograph on the wall spoke of love, dedication, and a son's unwavering commitment to his father. Marcus stood beside him, a quiet smile on his face. Eliza had excused herself to prepare dinner, leaving the two men alone in the space that held decades of memories. Walter's throat tightened. He turned to Marcus, his voice trembling. "Son, I don't know what to say. I doubted you. I thought you didn't care, that you wanted to get rid of me." Marcus's eyes softened, and he stepped forward, placing a firm yet gentle hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, you've never been a burden. Not once. Everything we did, all the late nights, all the weekends spent building this house, it was all because we love you, because you deserve to be happy." The sincerity in Marcus's voice was like a balm to Walter's wounded spirit. Overcome with emotion, Walter pulled his son into a tight hug. He held on as if letting go would undo everything, as if this embrace could convey the gratitude he couldn't put into words. "I'm so sorry," Walter whispered, his voice muffled against Marcus's shoulder. "I let my fears and loneliness blind me. I should have trusted you." Marcus pulled back just enough to look his father in the eye. "You've done so much for me, Dad. You raised me, loved me, and gave me a life I never would have had without you. This is the least I could do for you." The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken words. Marcus gestured toward the old armchair near the fireplace, the very chair Walter had spent countless evenings in, reading or simply gazing at the stars through the window. "Come sit, Dad." "There's more." Walter sat down, his fingers brushing over the armrests. The chair had been reupholstered, but it still carried the same comfort, the same familiarity. Marcus knelt beside him and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small leather-bound book. "This," Marcus began, handing it to Walter, "is a journal Evelyn kept. I found it while sorting through some of the things we managed to save after the fire." Walter's hands trembled as he opened the journal. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with Evelyn's neat handwriting. As he read, her words seemed to leap off the page, wrapping around him like a warm embrace. She had written about their life together, her love for him, and her dreams for their family. "She wanted this house to always feel like home," Marcus said quietly. "I thought you should have this, so her voice can always be with you." Walter's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. "Thank you," he choked out. This means everything to me." Later that evening, after a hearty dinner filled with stories and laughter, Walter began unpacking his belongings. Marcus and Eliza had left him to settle in, promising to return the next day with supplies to help him get started with his garden. As Walter opened his suitcase, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He pulled out his old photo frames, placing them carefully on the mantel. A picture of Evelyn smiling in their garden took center stage, her presence anchoring the room. Next, he arranged small keepsakes. A carved wooden bird Evelyn had once gifted him, a brass key from the original house, and a clock that had been in the family for decades. Each item carried a story, a memory that was now intertwined with this new chapter of his life. As Walter continued unpacking, he came across a small box at the bottom of his suitcase. Inside was an envelope addressed to Marcus. It was a letter he had written weeks ago, during one of his loneliest nights in Austin. In it, he had apologized for being a burden and asked Marcus to forgive him for the trouble he had caused. Walter held the letter in his hands for a long moment before tearing it into pieces. "No more doubts," he said to himself softly. "Marcus has shown me that love doesn't count burdens. It only counts blessings." Before turning in for the night, Walter stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of earth and wildflowers. Jasper stood grazing nearby, lifting his head as Walter approached. He ran his hand along the horse's mane, speaking to him as if they'd never been apart. "We're home, Jasper," Walter said with a smile. "And it's better than I could have ever imagined." The stars twinkled above, their light mirrored in the glistening windows of the house. For the first time in years, Walter felt truly at peace. He had thought he had lost everything: his wife, his home, his purpose. But tonight he realized he had gained something even greater, the knowledge that he was loved deeply and unconditionally. As he walked back inside and closed the door behind him, he paused for a moment, listening to the silence of the house. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of belonging. The following weeks unfurled with new rhythms and old joys. Marcus and Eliza visited every weekend, bringing groceries, garden supplies, and most importantly, their company. Walter found himself looking forward to these visits, not with anxiety, but with anticipation. They would work together in the garden, share meals on the porch, and talk late into the evening. One Saturday afternoon, as Walter watched Marcus repairing the garden fence, a realization washed over him. The distance he had felt in Austin wasn't because Marcus didn't care. It was because they both had been caught in misunderstandings and assumptions. "Marcus," Walter called, walking over to join his son. "I need to tell you something." Marcus set down his hammer, wiping sweat from his brow. "What is it, Dad?" "I misjudged you," Walter said simply. "Back in Austin, I thought your quick goodbyes and long work hours meant you were avoiding me. I listened to Diane's words about being unwanted rather than seeing what was right in front of me, that you were working hard to rebuild this place." Marcus's expression softened. "I should have told you what we were planning. I just wanted it to be perfect for you." Walter shook his head. "No, the surprise was worth it. But I've learned something important through all this. Assumptions can destroy what matters most. I assumed you didn't want me around when you were giving up every weekend to rebuild my home. And I assumed you understood how much you mean to us," Marcus replied. "I should have shown it more clearly." Walter smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We both have lessons to learn, it seems." That night, after Marcus and Eliza had returned to Austin, Walter sat on his porch under a blanket of stars, Evelyn's journal open in his lap. He read her words about family and belonging, about the home they had built together, not just in wood and stone, but in love and memories. "You were right, Evelyn," he whispered to the night sky. "Home isn't just a place. It's the people who make it worth returning to." In the months that followed, Walter's life took on new purpose. He expanded his garden, growing vegetables that he shared with neighbors. He rode Jasper along familiar paths, reconnecting with old friends who had believed him lost to the city. He filled his rebuilt house with new memories while honoring the old ones. On Walter's 73rd birthday, Marcus and Eliza surprised him with a small gathering. Neighbors and friends filled the yard, bringing food and laughter. As Walter blew out the candles on his cake, surrounded by people who genuinely cared for him, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. A year ago, he had sat alone with a store-bought slice of cake, convinced he was a burden to be discarded. Today, he sat amid a celebration organized by the very son he had doubted. The lesson wasn't lost on Walter. In life's darkest moments, when loneliness and fear cloud our judgment, We often create narratives that aren't true. We assume the worst in others because we feel the worst about ourselves. Walter had believed himself unwanted because he felt unworthy, had interpreted busyness as rejection because he feared abandonment. But the truth had been waiting all along, built plank by plank, memory by memory, in a house that stood as testament to love's enduring power. As the party wound down and guests departed, Walter found himself alone with Marcus and Eliza on the porch, just as they had been on that first evening of his homecoming. "You know," Walter said, breaking a comfortable silence, "I almost destroyed what mattered most, because I couldn't see past my own fears." "What do you mean, Dad?" Marcus asked. "I mean that I was so convinced I was a burden, that I never considered I might be valued. I was so afraid of being abandoned that I pushed you away first." Walter paused, looking out at the land he loved. "I wonder how many other elderly parents feel the same, unwanted and forgotten, when perhaps their children are simply struggling to show their love in ways that can be understood." Eliza reached over and took Walter's hand. "Communication goes both ways. We should have talked more openly about what we were planning, about how much you mean to us." Walter nodded. "That's the lesson in all this. Assumptions and silence create walls between people who love each other. Only by speaking our truths and listening with open hearts can we truly understand one another." He thought of the letter he had torn up, the letter full of apologies for existing, for needing help, for growing old. How close he had come to surrendering to despair, to accepting a false narrative about his worth and his place in his family's life. "The greatest gift you've given me," Walter continued, "isn't this house beautiful as it is? It's the reminder that I matter. That growing older doesn't mean becoming less valuable. That family doesn't measure worth by productivity or independence, but by love and shared history." As night fell and stars emerged overhead, Walter Reynolds sat in contentment, flanked by the son and daughter-in-law who had rebuilt not just his home, but his faith in family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Age doesn't pause its march, but he would face them with renewed confidence in his place in the world. In a society that too often sidelines its elderly, Walter had discovered that true family sees beyond limitations to the heart that beats with love and wisdom. His story wasn't ending in a nursing home as he had feared, but continuing in a home filled with purpose and connection. Walter gazed at the starlit sky and whispered a silent thanks to Evelyn for the family they had created, for the son who had shown him the true meaning of legacy, not in possessions passed down, but in love returned when needed most. Thank you for joining Walter on his journey from misunderstanding to homecoming. Have you experienced a moment when you realized you were deeply valued by someone you thought had forgotten you? Or perhaps you've gone to great lengths to show someone you care. Share your stories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming tales that remind us what truly matters in life.